For the first session of the 42nd Parliament. The meeting is being held in public and it's being televised. Pursuant to an order adopted by the committee on February 4th, we have with us today the Minister for Democratic Institutions, the Honourable Maryam Monsef, to speak and answer questions about the Independent Advisory Board for Senate appointments. The Minister is accompanied by Ian McGowan, Deputy Secretary to the Cabinet, Legislation and House Planning and Machinery of Government, Privy Council Office. In our second hour, we will be talking about the witness list and the caucus reports on family-friendly Parliament. I'll now, sorry for starting so quickly, but I wanted to be on time so you didn't lose any questioning time with the Minister. Thank you, Minister, for coming. I know there's great anticipation to have you here to talk about the new Senate process, and we'll start right away so we get the full amount of questioning in, and I'll let you do your opening statement. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all committee members. What an honor it is to be here with you today on this traditional territory of the Algonquin peoples. We talked about this last night. Had it not been for all the ways that settlers like me were welcomed onto this land, we would not have succeeded individually or collectively. As you mentioned, Mr. Chair, I have the great privilege of being accompanied by Mr. Ian McGowan, and as Minister for Democratic Institutions, I have a mandate to deliver on the government's commitment to strengthen the openness and fairness of our democratic institutions. This committee, your committee, plays an important role in delivering on this commitment, and I sincerely believe that it can lead the way in elevating the tone and the conduct of how we represent ourselves and in committees in the House to our constituents, and how we deliberate on issues that matter most to Canadians. As part of my mandate, I have the lead role in all matters relating to the development and implementation of the process with respect to the Independent Advisory Board for Senate appointments. Think of me as the custodian of the process, and I can answer any questions you may have about its establishment, including the Advisory Board's terms of reference and the criteria being used to assess candidates. Now, the Advisory Board is an independent, arm's-length body. As such, I am not in a position to speak on their behalf. As many of us agree, the Senate plays an important role in our democratic system. However, its legitimacy has suffered because of the partisan nature of the appointment system. It's become a place where political ties are often perceived as being more important than the best interests of Canadians. The new merit-based process to advise the Prime Minister on Senate appointments was designed to remove that partisan element and to help reinvigorate the Senate. Before getting into the details of the process, I think it's important to have an understanding of the four principles that reinforce its legitimacy and effectiveness. First, the process recognizes the important role that Senate has in providing sober second thought, regional representation, as well as representation for minorities. Second, the process respects the constitutional framework by maintaining the Governor-General's power to appoint senators on the advice of the Prime Minister. Third, the process includes elements to promote transparency and accountability, including the public merit-based criteria for Senate nominees, public terms of reference for the Advisory Board, and public reporting on the process itself. Fourth, the process is designed to select Senate nominees who can conduct themselves in an independent, nonpartisan fashion. Canadians have asked for change, yes, but they do not wish our government to enter into constitutional negotiations. This new process delivers on that. The government is also fully confident that the new process respects our constitutional framework. The key component of the new process is the Independent Advisory Board, which has a mandate to provide the Prime Minister with non-binding merit-based recommendations on Senate appointments. The advisory board consists of 5 members, a federal chair and 2 other permanent federal members whom you have met, 2 ad hoc provincial members from each of the provinces or the territories where vacancies exist. So you've met the chair of the advisory board, Ms. Huguette Lebel. She's been recognized many times for her senior leadership roles in public service, and her years of experience do provide her with a solid basis to meet the challenges of leading the advisory process. You may also be interested to know she brings a depth of knowledge on matters related to transparency as past chair of Transparency International. Professor Danielle Jutra and Dr. Indira Samarasekera have been here before, and all of the advisory board members are impressive. I could take all of the time we have here together talking about each one of them individually, but what I want to leave you with is the confidence that they represent a range of experiences from all walks of life, whether it's education, constitutional law, science, medicine, and the arts. Now, there are 2 phases to the process that we have introduced. In the transitional phase, which is well underway, the advisory board is responsible for providing the Prime Minister with a shortlist for 5 vacancies in 3 provinces, 2 in Manitoba, 2 in Ontario, and 1 in Quebec. In this phase, the advisory board was mandated to consult with a wide variety of groups, including Indigenous, linguistic, minority, and ethnic communities, provincial, territorial, and municipal organizations, labor organizations, community-based groups, arts councils, and provincial territorial chambers of commerce. The idea here was to allow the board to hear from a diverse range of individuals and bring forward a list that includes people from a diversity of backgrounds, experiences, but also knowledge of the Senate. The permanent phase will begin shortly after the completion of the transitional phase and the appointments of the first 5 senators. In the permanent phase, the remaining vacancies will be filled from the 7 provinces where vacancies currently exist. Now, in the permanent phase, all Canadians will be able to apply directly for appointment to the Senate. Let me tell you a little bit about the criteria. In both phases, the advisory board will assess potential candidates on the basis of transparent, merit-based criteria. These criteria are public. They include the following. Candidates, and I believe you have the criteria, candidates must have a record of achievement and leadership, either in service to their community, the public, their profession, or their field of expertise. Candidates will need to possess outstanding and proven personal qualities in terms of public life, ethics, and integrity. Candidates will also be expected to have an ability to bring a perspective and contribution to the work of the Senate that is clearly independent and nonpartisan. Candidates must have demonstrated an understanding of the Senate's role in our constitutional framework, including the role of the Senate as an independent body of sober second thought, the role it plays in regional representation, and the representation it provides to minorities. Now, these criteria will be applied in a way that respects the importance of gender balance and Canada's diversity in the selection process. The public criteria will provide an important framework for the entire process, both in terms of ensuring that candidates of the highest standard are selected, but also to allow Canadians to hold us accountable to this process. I'd now like to talk about our commitment to carry out an open and transparent process. As I've mentioned earlier, one of the foundational principles of this process is the importance of transparency and accountability. In that context, each step of the process has been designed to be as open and transparent as possible. The merit-based criteria for Senate nominees was published online so that all Canadians could see the qualification skill sets that the advisory board has been using to assess candidates. When the advisory board was appointed, the government published the terms of reference setting out the board's mandate. The advisory board itself established a public website calling for nominations during the transitional phase and has reached out broadly to consult with organizations. The permanent phase of the advisory process will feature an open application process to which any qualified Canadian can submit an application. And of course, there's a requirement that the advisory board provide us with a report on their activities after each cycle of appointment. Now, I believe this is an unprecedented level of openness in a process that has been previously shrouded in secrecy. That said, in order to attract the best and brightest candidates, a degree of confidentiality is required in order for the process to succeed, just as is the case with any other job competition. We want to ensure that all qualified individuals from diverse backgrounds have the confidence to put their names forward without fearing that at the end of the process their names or other personal information will be publicized. It's for that reason that the names of unsuccessful candidates will not be received. I am happy to answer any questions that you may have, given that I had 3 lines to read and yet the chair has waved and said time is up.
Order, I think we can extend the minister the necessary time to read the remaining 3 lines. We think we should extend that obvious courtesy.
Okay, you can do your 3 lines.
Well, what a good man you are, sir. To conclude, I am confident that the advisory process will help to reinvigorate the Senate in a way that reinforces its fundamental role in our parliamentary system while reducing partisanship. I look forward to working with your committee, not only on Senate reform, but also on the government's various mandates to strengthen our democracy and restore the public's trust in our institutions. We all have a role to play in setting a positive tone for that debate. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the honourable member who's also my critic.
Thank you, Minister. And now we're going to the first round of 7-minute questioning or comments, and we'll start with Madam Petitpas-Taylor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. First and foremost, Minister Monsef, thank you for taking the time to come and meeting with our committee today. We recognize that you're extremely busy, and on such short notice, you made the time, and we appreciate your presentation and your willingness to meet and answer our questions. The first question that I may have is, you've indicated that you're the custodian of the process. I'm wondering if you or if the advisory board has had the opportunity to meet with the provinces regarding the actual process that's in place right now.
Through you, Mr. Chair, it's a great pleasure to be here. I've been looking forward to this. When we began setting out the framework for this process, we decided that an important hallmark would be that for the first time, provinces would be included in this conversation. And to that end, I reached out to my colleagues in Ontario, in Quebec, in Manitoba, and we asked each province to provide us with a list of 5 individuals who would represent their respective provinces on the ad hoc committee for the provinces with the vacancies. And we had very productive conversations, and in the end, I was pleased to receive names from Ontario and Quebec, and after the process was wrapped up in terms of filling those seats on the advisory board, we asked all 3 provinces to provide us feedback on how we can improve the transitional process as we turn it into a permanent phase. And we look forward to continuing that collaboration.
And have you received any feedback from the province regarding those consultations that you had with them?
So all 3 provinces were thrilled that we were having this conversation and we were engaging on the Senate appointments process. And the feedback that we've received from all three, we will be giving serious consideration as we move forward to enhance the permanent phase if that need be.
And one last question for me as I'm sharing my time with Ms. Sahota here. Could you perhaps speak to us about the present process, how it compares to the past process or the previous process?
Well, I'm sure that we join many Canadians who are curious about what the process was in governments past. The difference here is that there is a process. The difference here is that the process is public. The difference here is that whether it's the criteria that we're asking the advisory board to assess potential candidates, or their terms of reference, or the report that the advisory board will release after the process has wrapped up, all of this is out there, open for public's review. And the reason for that is we feel it's important to enhance Canadians' trust and confidence in this institution. And one of the best ways that we can do that is to include Canadians in the process instead of attempting to do this behind the curtain.
Thank you very much.
Ms. Sahota?
Yes, thank you for being with us here today, Minister. We've been looking forward to your visit. You have touched upon this quite a bit, but why, in your opinion, do you feel, or this government feels, that this process is the preferred process and will actually work in comparison to the previous process that we don't know much about?
Well, we believe that the establishment of the advisory board and the framework that we have outlined, that in itself is a huge success. We are attempting something that hasn't been done before, and we recognize that it's a challenge, but mostly in this is a great deal of opportunity. We are confident that it will work because we have received positive feedback from Canadians. We're confident it will work because we have received positive feedback from some senators already. Some people in this room were at the parliamentary consultation that I hosted, and the feedback I received there, whether it was from members of parliament or senators across party line, was that confidence that we were aiming for, that level of trust that we were hoping to increase, that's already happening. And I look forward to having that first 5 group appointed, and I believe that their merit and their qualifications and their contributions will speak for themselves.
Okay. You stated some of the permanent federal members that came before this committee before about their background and how they're well diverse. But in particular, if you could, give us an example of what kind of qualities you were looking for in these permanent members, and also in the ad hoc members. You're saying that you asked the provinces to present you 5, from which you would choose 2. So, how did you make that narrowing down of who you would choose to put on
The criteria that the Prime Minister and the Governor and Council took into consideration when appointing the advisory board members is very much in line with the criteria that we've asked the advisory board to use to assess potential Senate candidates. We were looking for individuals who were demonstrating and had demonstrated leadership and service to their communities. We were looking for individuals who had been accountable to their stakeholders. We were looking for individuals who understood the importance of the Senate within our constitutional framework, recognize the role that the Senate plays in providing that sober second thought as an upper chamber. We were looking for people who could demonstrate the ability to conduct their work in an independent and nonpartisan fashion, and we were looking for people who have done their work and have worked their lives demonstrating those personal qualities around ethics and integrity as well. And we also wanted to make sure that the different ranges of experiences and backgrounds that are reflected within Canadian society would be reflected within the advisory board, and we are happy to say that we believe we have achieved that.
Thank you, Ms. Sahota. And now we'll go to Mr. Reid.
Thank you, Minister. It's a pleasure to have you here. I miss our question period exchanges in the House of Commons. I thought we were like the Disraeli and Gladstone of the 42nd Parliament, or maybe the Churchill and Lady Astor, or the Archie and Mehetabel. Anyway, it was a pleasure while it lasted. I had a series of 3 questions that I think are so closely related that it is more logical for me to answer or rather ask them as a chunk rather than separately. So regarding the advisory boards and the lists that they have been compiling, when you and Minister LeBlanc appeared before the Senate Rules Committee, he indicated that the advisory boards needed some extra time. He said a couple of extra weeks. My first question, therefore, is, have the lists yet been submitted to the Prime Minister? The second question I have is the decision regarding the Phase 1 process to send out nomination forms as well as applications. Was that made by the government, or was it made by the advisory boards? And then thirdly, Mariam Bedard, who serves as a Quebec member on one of the advisory boards, the one dealing with Quebec, indicated that about 100 requests for nominations had been sent out. A, is that more or less a standard number for all 3 of the provinces? And B, how many of those came back? How many actual nominations were received? From how large a pool in the end were you dealing with, or was the advisory board dealing with?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I thank the honourable member for his question, and I do miss our back and forth in the House of Commons, and I will take this opportunity to point out that that process is completely in your hands, sir. So whenever you're ready to come back to our back and forth in the House of Commons, I impatiently await. I do appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation with you here today. Your question, I want to make it very clear that the independent arm's length nature of the advisory board, as you can all appreciate, it makes it so that I have not been involved in the consultations that they've had. I have not seen any of the lists that they've received or the lists that are being recommended or where the lists are at, for that matter. What I do know is that we, recognizing that this particular group of Canadians who put quite a bit on the line to be part of something that's not been done before, we wanted to provide them with the right tools and the right capacity to do that work. And so they're in the process of carrying out the transitional phase of the process. Once that phase has wrapped up, they will be providing us, you, and all Canadians with a report on how the process went, who they reached out to, so on and so forth. So the application process, the forms, the independent advisory board independently chose to take that route because they must have felt that it was the right thing to do. So I don't have any more details about numbers or where their process and outreach is at. All I can tell you is that I join you also impatiently awaiting the list and any reports that they may have about the process.
Okay, thank you. So just for the benefit of other members here, this is why we want to get the members of the advisory board back again. It was an issue that Mr. Chan spoke at length about why we don't want them back again. We can get this information from the minister. Turns out the questions that I raised here, which are the same ones I raised to members of the advisory board, and which were found to be out of order, are precisely the ones that can only be addressed if you guys on the Liberal side do not attempt to prevent us from bringing them back again. Otherwise, we get no transparency or openness at all. My next question for the minister is this. You had indicated to the media on February the 1st, I'm quoting here from a Joan Bryden article, it says, Minister Monsef says she's, quote, not ready to commit to a categorical rejection of a referendum on electoral reform. And I had a sense that you hadn't shut the door completely from your previous answers and Minister LeBlanc's previous comments. My question is this. Under what circumstances would we get a categorical yes or no from the government to a referendum on electoral reform?
I'd like to make a point of order here. I don't think this is relevant. We've called the minister in to discuss the Senate appointment process. We have only 1 hour in which to answer a lot of important questions which Mr. Reid wanted answered for a long time. So I believe we should continue staying within the mandate that we asked them.
Minister, it's up to you whether you want to respond. You were only called here on the Senate, and it's fair that if you only want to answer that.
Well, it's just like old times, Mr. Chair. Let me just go back to your comment earlier. From what I understand, the advisory board members were asked to appear before this committee so that you could assess their qualifications to determine whether or not they were the right people to be leading this process. And I hope that to that end, your questions and curiosity has been satisfied. Your committee is the master of its own destiny, but rest assured that one of the aspects around transparency and openness within this process is the fact that there will be a report that will include the answers to the questions that we all have about how this process went. And so let's wait for that report. As for the familiar question that you have asked, as I have shared in the House, to the media, during our one-on-one conversation, the process will engage Canadians in a meaningful and inclusive conversation about how we may enhance our electoral system so that those who are not currently engaged feel like they have a voice and that they have a place within this place and within the decisions that we make as a government. It is too early to prejudge the outcome of that process.
What criteria will you use when it is no longer too early? At some point, it won't be too early, but none of us know what the criteria are that you will be using. And it's hard, given the fact that the Chief Electoral Officer has just prepared a report released, I believe yesterday or the day before, stating that he will need extra time to deal with the referendum process, and he'll also need extra time to deal with any electoral boundary redistribution that might occur as a result of this process. Effectively, as you take more time, you start precluding options. And it's not very hard to design a system so that only one option is left, which happens to be the one that your Prime Minister has indicated he prefers.
Point
My
of order.
concern is that we get an answer as to what your criteria would be.
Okay.
Chair, I'd like
before you do the point of order, the time's up, so maybe it's not necessary.
But I still think it's necessary to maybe have a ruling on that point of order that I made previously, because if we continue in this fashion, the time is going to be up pretty soon, and we're not going to get to the relevant matter we've called the minister here on.
Okay, well, I'll leave it to the minister to whether she wants to answer questions on things that she wasn't called here for, but it's up to the members how they want to use their questioning time. So we'll move on to Mr. Christofferson.
Great. Thank you, Chair. Minister, thank you very much for your appearance. And if I may, I'd like to begin on a personal note, not necessarily a political one. I just want to say, Minister, that you're not of my political party. You're the opposite gender to me. You are one half my age. And yet I want you to know how proud I am to see you sitting there as a minister for Canada, because to me, it's not just a success story for the Liberals. I think Canada gets to claim part of the success. You're a symbol of how Canada works, and I'm so incredibly proud that we have a country that would have someone with your background arrive in that chair as our minister, and I wish you all the best on a personal basis.
Well, thank you, sir.
And now I will do you the ultimate respect and treat you the same as I would any other minister, and you would expect no less. First of all, of course, this whole charade is something that we in the NDP aren't buying into, and I would just, by way of visualizing that, say if we were starting with a blank slate and saying the government of Canada, say to the people of Canada, we'll select your government by an appointment process, and they'll be your representatives for lawmaking, there'd be a revolution. But we don't do that. But what we did say was that we'll split the decision-making for laws in two parts, and you get to elect one part, but the other one we still stay in the dark ages and appoint. And that's still the way we view this. It's legal, but it does not have legitimacy in the eyes of the Canadian people in this day and age, that the upper house, of whom there are fewer than us, and therefore their vote is worth more than that of an MP, is nothing short of disgraceful as we present ourselves to the world as a mature democracy. Having said that, it is still there, and this process is there, and we have to deal with it. You mentioned on page 3 of your remarks, Minister, 1, 2, 3, there were at least four criteria that you'll be looking for. And what I would like to know is, what are the assurances and guarantee in those new transparent criteria that would guarantee the likes of a Senator Duffy and a Senator Brazeau would not happen again?
Through you, Mr. Chair, thank you to the honourable member for his kind remarks. I do appreciate it, and I recognize what a privilege it is to be here. What woman in my lineage could have ever dreamed of being in this place? And it's one of the reasons why every time I'm asked to appear before a committee, every time I'm asked to rise in the House to answer a question, I consider it a great honor, and it's why I take my role as custodian of this process so seriously. When we were developing our platform as a party, the now Prime Minister spent 3 years speaking and listening to Canadians, to experts, to different groups, to academics. And when we developed our policy plank around a more open and transparent government, we heard loud and clear from Canadians that the Senate does need to change, that despite the good work of senators for generations, the effectiveness of the Senate has been hampered by that perception of partisanship, and we also heard loud and clear from Canadians that they do not want us to bring about change that would include protracted constitutional debate. Canadians want us to focus on their issues: growing the economy, the environment and climate change, addressing the issues around missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And so the process that we have introduced takes into account the constitutional framework that we need to be working within. And so the processes that we've outlined, the accountability and the transparency that's embedded in it, the wide range of organizations and individuals who will be consulted, who will be asked to put their names forward, all of these will lead to a stronger and a more effective Senate. And in just a few weeks, in just a few months, any Canadian that meets the constitutional requirements may put their name forward to be considered for appointment to
You're
the
right.
Senate.
You're right, Minister. And anybody who buys a lottery ticket also stands to be a multimillionaire by the end of the week. It sounds good in theory. I didn't hear anything that really answered my question. The reality is that we've just gone from an appointed process to a more expanded appointed process, where other appointed people will now decide who the appointed people are going to be. And the fact is that when we get a bad one, and bad MPs get elected, but there's a mechanism to get rid of them. It's called an election. With senators, we're stuck with them till they're 75 years old. So I don't see anything in this criteria, Minister, with respect, that's going to prevent the likes of another Senator Duffy or another Brazeau or give me the Liberal balance, Max Harb, to still find their way into the Senate. It's still unaccountable and it's still unacceptable. But I want to pursue a couple things. You mentioned, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Minister, that you had received names for appointees to be on the selection committee from every province. But what about Manitoba? Did you have names submitted from Manitoba?
Let me just go back to your
Not too
previous,
far back, Minister. My time is tight.
not too far back, but you felt that I didn't answer your question. Dear sir, you began your line of questioning with congratulating me on finding myself in this place. This is Canada, and if somebody like me can get herself elected in Canada, if somebody like me can be appointed to the Prime Minister's cabinet in Canada, then in this country anything is possible. So I want to leave that piece with
yourself. You got there because of the power of election, Minister, with respect, not because you knew somebody.
And this is the spirit in which this new process is designed as well. And I'm looking, and the Prime Minister is looking, to bring more people like Senator Chaput to the Senate. We're looking for more Romeo Dallaires. We're looking for more Serge Royals. We are looking for individuals like those who are in that chamber, who have been in that chamber before, to join their ranks. And so that's the place that we're coming
Jane
from.
Smith. What about John and Jane Smith? You give all these great, luminaries, and yet we're ordinary people. You're ordinary people. I'm ordinary people. We got here through election. This process is not going to put ordinary people in the Senate. If anything, there'll be tokens.
Okay, thank you, David and Minister. The time's up for this round, and we will now go to Mr. Graham.
From one David to another. Mr. Chair, I'll be sharing my time with my old boss, the former critic for Democratic Reform, Scott Sims. I wanted to address a little bit of what I think is the very important role of the Senate. For me, the Senate is actually a very valuable institution. I think it's very important to this country to have a body that does not have to worry about their next job and their next election, so they can make what I call a sober second decision regardless of alcohol, David. Of alcohol. It's not that kind of sober. Joke. Joke, yes. Anyhow, so for me, the Constitution mandates the Senate exists. We can't get around that without having a wonderful big constitutional debate, which we've had many of in this country and we've all very much enjoyed. Precisely. And so I wonder if you could talk about the importance of the Constitution in this process and how we're managing to stay within the bounds of it while making real significant change to the Senate that will change how we get there.
Mr. Chair, we are confident that this new process works within the confines or the parameters of the Constitution and the Supreme Court ruling. I'm surrounded by bright individuals who assure me that we've maintained the Prime Minister and the Governor General's independence in that process. The changes that we have introduced don't change what's already there in terms of constitutional requirements. They only enhance the criteria. The process of appointments is a public, transparent, merit-based one, and I believe that is where the greatest amount of change is coming from, and we will be able to see that within the caliber of the individuals who are appointed. Now, I understand that you folks have a lot of fun around this table, and that this particular conversation has been one that you've had before, and perhaps if Ian, would you like to share your thoughts around this particular piece?
No, I mean, as I think the minister indicated, the proposal was developed very much in mind of the Supreme Court of Canada's decision in the Senate reference case. Obviously, there's a number of important markers that were laid down there, and that's very much a part of the framing of the proposal in question.
How much time do I have?
You've spent 2 minutes and 43 seconds.
Okay. I don't want to take into too much of Scott's time because he's a good speaker. So we hear a lot that the Senate should be either appointed or either elected or abolished, which if we have an elected Senate, do you see any value to an elected Senate? For me, if we have an elected Senate, it has to assert its role, it has to assert its purpose, and therefore becomes a competition rather than a complement to the House of Commons. Do you agree with that view of the Senate?
I come from a place where the democratic institutions that we have here are dreamed of, are longed for, and while what we have is great, it can be so much better. And while we will be bringing about various reforms, there are some core foundational aspects of our current system that we would do well to maintain, including that particular role that Senate plays as a body to provide that independent, sober second thought without having to worry about the next election. Now, I want to talk about ordinary people being part of this process because I think it's really important. Ordinary people may not have the appetite that we do to find the means and the courage to run for public office. Ordinary people, how many people applied for the job that you and I have? Not very many people find compelling the process of going through a campaign. What our process is going to do,
Well,
our process is going to we're opening it up to all Canadians so that even those who do not find it exciting to run for an elected position may be included in this process.
Okay, well, thank you for your leadership on this. I'll give over to Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Grant.
Thank you, Minister. It's good to see you again. Every time we always engage in this argument, we always come around to the names of the people who are all say to the base degrees by which their behavior is set here in this place. Now, I'm not looking directly at you, sir. I'm just waxing on metaphorically. You just haven't been in the line of sight. So I guess what I'm looking at, we know the names that we've already brought up, the Brezos of the world, and these people, Mac Harbs of the world, right? Let's take a moment to talk about the people who have done really good stuff here. Let's talk about, as the minister pointed out, Romeo Zeller. Let's talk about Hugh Segal, who's done tremendous work. Let's talk about Michael Kirby, whose reports on health have been cited amongst institutions across this country, all of them. But they started out as ordinary, David. They started out as ordinary people who did extraordinary work and continues to do extraordinary work in all these places. What I would say to people, this process is something that goes that way. Now, in the last election, I'll get to my question. In the last election, we had 3 options on the table, one of which we're talking about right here now. The other 2 included an election of the Senate. The other required abolishing. Now, on April 2014, the Supreme Court was quite clear as to what you desired, and the opposition never reached out to any of the provinces to either elect it or to abolish it. Not one. It became a Twitter campaign with hashtag disingenuous. I'm a little upset about this because I thought the whole thing was disingenuous. The plan was not thought out right. This plan, I'll get to my question now. My plan is, and when it came out that we would do this appointment process, there were a lot of people who criticized us and said, but you too need to open up the Constitution in order to do this process. But that's not the case, is it, Minister?
15 seconds, Minister.
No, it is not.
Okay, that's close enough. We'll now go on to Mr. Richards.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Minister, I appreciate you being here today. I'm glad you're able to make this a priority in your schedule to be at this committee finally. I guess I'll start with a question, and I assume that you would agree with this statement that the ability of Canadians to be able to cast their vote and to be able to have their voices heard in an election is an important part of democracy. I assume you would agree.
Is that your first
I assume you would
question?
agree with that statement.
I think more Canadians should be voting.
Okay, great. I'm glad to hear that you think that's an important value in our democracy because 309,587 Albertans had a chance to cast their vote for a man named Mike Shake in Alberta to be their next senator when the next Senate vacancy comes up. And this is follows in a long history. In 1989, Stan Waters was elected by the people of Alberta and appointed to the Senate in 1990. And then in 1998, Burt Brown and Ted Morton were chosen by Albertans, but unfortunately ignored by the Liberal governments of the day. Then we had in 2004, Burt Brown, who was elected and then appointed to the Senate in 2007, and then Betty Unger, who was appointed in 2012. In 2012, we had another senatorial selection process in Alberta, and the winner of that process was Doug Black, who was, of course, appointed in 2013, and then Scott Tanis, who was appointed later in 2013. So the next vacancy that appears in the Senate for Alberta should be filled by Mike Shake. As I said, he was elected by over 309,000 Albertans, which I would point out is more votes than every single member of this committee combined received in the last election. So the question I would have, and I mean, we've certainly heard in your indication at the Senate committee, and when I asked your parliamentary secretary in the House of Commons, that somehow there was a belief that that somehow isn't merit-based. And I guess I would have to ask, how do you not see 300,000 Albertans choosing someone to be their senator in a legitimate senatorial selection process? How do you not see that as merit-based? How is it that you can tell Albertans that those 309,000 people that voted for Mike Shake, that their opinions aren't based on merit, that their vote for him isn't merit-based? I just don't understand that.
Well, let's start with the first premise, that neither you nor me nor anyone in this room has the constitutional prerogative that the Prime Minister has to advise the Governor General on whom to consider for these Senate positions. So that's the first place that we're going to come from. Secondly, I'm sure Mr. Shake is an exceptional Canadian who has contributed to the province of Alberta in extraordinary ways, and I congratulate him. Now, the next opening, the vacancy for Alberta, is going to be in 2018, I believe. And the process that we have introduced will allow for any Canadian, ordinary Canadians who have done extraordinary things in their lives to put their name forward for consideration to Senate. That means people who do not have the means to engage in what can be an expensive election campaign are included in this process. This means individuals who may not have the desire that you and I had to knock on doors to get elected to be included in this process. We are opening up this process to all Canadians in just a matter of weeks, and I look forward to Mr. Shake and anyone else from Alberta putting their name forward for consideration by the Advisory Board and the Prime Minister.
Okay. Well, I appreciate the answer, but it isn't about Mike Shake. It's about Albertans. It's about their choice. It's about their right to democratically select the people they've chosen. That's something that's been respected by past prime ministers. It's really unfortunate that this current prime minister will not be respecting that. Let me move on, though, because I don't sense I'll get a different response about the idea of the importance of democratic election and that Alberta, and the disrespecting of Albertans. So we'll move on, because I wanted to ask. You mentioned in your opening remarks about Ontario and Quebec, and that you've had a list of names come forward. You didn't mention Manitoba, which is also, of course, on there. And obviously, their government indicated they weren't interested in being a part of the process. So I guess I want to ask two things. First of all, how were the two advisory board members for Manitoba selected, given that Manitoba was not interested in being a part of the process? And have you received a list from Manitoba? And if not, when do we expect to receive that list? Why the delay?
Just briefly, Minister.
I had very productive and positive conversations with my colleagues in Manitoba, and I understand and respect their reasons for not being able to participate in the transitional phase, but I do look forward to working with them on this file moving forward and on other files. As we indicated at the outset of this process, in the event that a province or territory is not able to participate in the appointment of ad hoc members to the board, we would proceed to appoint individuals, and we did. We found two exceptional Manitobans, these two incredible women who are serving their province well, and we're pleased to hear from the leadership in Manitoba that they approve of the choice as well.
Thank you, Minister. We'll now move on to Ms. Van den Belt.
Thank you very much, Minister Monsef, for coming before this committee. And I want to thank you also for your hard work and your dedication to improving Canadians' confidence in our democratic institutions. So before I begin with my questions, I noted that you didn't get a chance to answer the question from my colleague, Mr. Sims, about the Constitution. So if you wish, I can give you a few moments to answer that question before I begin with mine.
We are confident that this process respects the constitutional framework. And in fact, I'd like to assure everyone in this room and those watching this that all our decisions as a government are guided by the Constitution and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We respect our democratic institutions, including the Supreme Court of Canada, and it's refreshing to see that we are all on the same page.
Thank you. I'd like to talk a little bit about how this process, how you view this process improving the way that the Senate functions, the way it functions in its committees, the collegiality, the independence and nonpartisanship of the Senate. As we know, traditionally, the Senate has always been viewed as being more collegial and senators not always wearing their political party hat. In recent years, that's diminished somewhat, but this is a process that has never before been seen in terms of selecting senators. Already, the Prime Minister has made Liberal senators independent, not subject to party discipline. And with the new senators coming in, who will also be independent and not subject to party discipline and not appointed solely at the discretion of the Prime Minister without consultation, how do you see that improving the tone and elevating the tone of the debate in the Senate?
Thank you for your question. The tone is an important measure of success on its own, but before I go into this in any further detail, it's important to recognize that we, as the lower chamber, have certain limits that we can work within when it comes to our relationship within the Senate. The Senate's own rules, the way that they operate within their committees, their own conduct and their own activities, that is up to them. That is not for us to dictate. And so we're doing where we are able to make a difference, and that is within an appointments process that puts merit ahead of patronage, that opens it up to all Canadians so that people who may have never been considered for these positions can begin to be and to reflect Canada's diversity in the process. And we believe that reducing partisanship, encouraging independence will mean that senators will feel more confident and comfortable to serve the best interests of Canadians as opposed to any political party. And I think that's a huge win for Canadian democracy.
I'd like to pick up on your comments about the diversity, because we all know that the public policy benefits when there are more voices at the table with different life experiences, with different backgrounds. This is a process that, as you mentioned in the criteria, that will be able to bring in people who have different kinds of experiences that they bring to the table, different perspectives. Is that something that you also see improving the debate in the Senate?
I firmly believe that when you bring people from different walks of life around a table to make decisions on behalf of Canadians from all walks of life, the tone, the nature of the debate, the amount of deliberation, the different perspectives that may not have been included in the past, all of that will be present, and the end result will be better outcomes for Canadians in terms of policies and programs we implement. And it's why, and I'm proud to be part of a government that recognizes that. I'm proud to serve a Prime Minister who appreciates that, who not only has a commitment to all Canadians that he will incorporate gender, linguistic, ethnic, and cultural diversity in his appointments to cabinet, but he's demonstrated that with a gender balanced cabinet. And one of the criteria that we've asked the advisory board to be especially mindful of, and something that the Prime Minister will give serious attention to when making his recommendations to the Governor General, is just that, because we know that when you add women, when you bring people from different cultural groups into conversations that we have in this House and in the in the other House, that it can only lead to better outcomes for Canadians, and that's one way that we can lead the world. It's one way that we can lead the world in terms of how a strong democracy can function, and I think that's our responsibility as Canadians as well.
We'll now go on to Mr. Schmale for a 5-minute round.
Thank you very much, Minister. It's great to see you again. For those that don't know, we share a geographical boundary, and we share the, well, Peterborough County, I guess we share that. So I look forward to continuing to work on the various issues together on that. And so it's great to see you in this capacity.
Well, thank you, sir.
Very nice to see you. Something you said that kind of piqued my interest. You had mentioned about the process that some people, now possibly being appointed to the Senate, but before you thought the current system of being elected, whether you run for nominations, then you go to the general election. You said some people might be a little disheartened by going through that whole process of, meeting the people that get to elect them, to appoint them to a legislative body. And I thought that was kind of interesting because, as we know, the Senate, as Mr. Christopherson, Mr. Reid pointed out many times, there's less of them. They have more power than the House of Commons. So, and I see a quote here from Emmett McFarland, who was the original designer of this process you're using, had quoted said, "Serving in the Senate should be the result of answering a call, not making a call," which I put 2 and 2 together. And what? Why is it easier for them to go in this process of just putting a letter to the Prime Minister asking for an appointment rather than actually knocking on the doors, listening to people, and meeting the constituents you are hoping to represent?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to thank the honourable member, firstly, for his leadership around raising awareness for ALS. The work that you're doing with our colleague Greg Fergus is admirable, and I thank you for that. And I look forward to serving the people of Peterborough and Peterborough-Kawartha with you. Now, no Canadian will be able to write a letter to the Prime Minister and be appointed to Senate. That's actually not how this process works out. Canadians will be able to apply, and there will be an advisory board, independent, arm's length, that will assess the qualifications of these individuals and make non-binding recommendations to the Prime Minister. So it's not just, I'm going to write a letter to the Prime Minister and hopefully he'll say yes. That may have been the old way, but it's certainly not the way that we're moving forward. I believe that being able to participate in an election, especially as a candidate, is a great privilege, and I have a lot of respect for the process itself. But this process is meant to be inclusive. It's meant to work within the constitutional framework. And so in that spirit of inclusion, let's take a moment to reflect. I know many of us have not had a chance to because we've all hit the ground running since October 19th. Let's think about how expensive an election campaign is. Let's think about what a privilege it is for us as able-bodied individuals to be able to go out and to knock on doors and to walk door to door and to be standing on our feet at various events. Let's take a moment to reflect on what a great privilege that is. And let's recognize that not everyone has the means to participate in what can be an expensive election campaign. Let's recognize that not everyone has the physical capacity to go out and to knock on doors. But that does not mean that individuals who cannot do it, either of those things, that does not mean that these individuals are not connected to their communities, that are not serving the best interests of their regions. What this process is doing is opening it up and creating a level playing field within the constitutional framework that will allow all Canadians from all backgrounds, from various socioeconomic status, with various disabilities and exceptionalities and abilities to put their names forward for consideration to Senate. And I think that is something that we can all be tremendously proud of.
Thank you. I would say that everyone has the same opportunity with selling memberships. That doesn't cost anything, and that is part of the process. What I've noticed here also, we talked about a lot of transparency and openness, which is great. You changed the process, but basically, when I look at this, all you did was basically put another level of the decision-making process. So the names being submitted to this advisory panel are being kept in secret. The names selected to go to the Prime Minister are being done in secret. So rather than just the people in the Prime Minister's office making that decision or finding the names, basically you've given everyone the ability to apply, which is a good thing. However, we don't know who has applied, who are the names, who's being considered, and what out of all, if the Prime Minister selected this person, well, who are the others that didn't get selected, and why? So basically, in my opinion, you're just basically, that's just another level, and it's done behind the curtain. I think someone said it wasn't, but I don't see anything other than you get to apply. What is different? What is being done, in front of the curtain?
Well, what is being done is that in the past, there would not have been a conversation like this by this committee about a Senate appointments process because, frankly, in the past, there was not a process that was open in any way to the public. And with the greatest of respects, this is more change and more of an improvement than any other process that has existed before in the past around appointments to the Senate. I challenge you to reflect on where the process was when the former government appointed nearly 60 senators.
Respectfully,
and so this
Madam Minister, I would disagree.
Difference.
We had an election in Alberta.
The difference here is that the criteria that individuals are being assessed against is based on merit and not political patronage.
But I would also argue that there are a number of senators with very extensive resumes.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Smalley. We're time. So thank you very much for coming, Minister, and I'm sure we'll have future conversations. We'll suspend for a few minutes.
Thank you very much. Thanks for your good work.
1 minute so we don't lose a lot of our time. So this is a very productive working committee, so we'd like to get lots done, so I'm calling us back so we don't socialize too much. We got a lot of two really important things we have to do on our family-friendly report. One is the caucus reports, and the other is the witnesses. And we can decide later whether we go in camera for the witnesses, which we normally do. But I suggest we do the caucus reports first because the NDP whip is here to present the NDP caucus report, and I think she has other. She'd prefer to be able to do that so she can carry on with her other duties.
Is it in public or in camera?
And she has no problem with being in public.
Okay. All right.
Does anyone have any problem with being in public for the caucus reports? No. Okay. So if that's okay, and maybe in deference to the whips, I know they're very busy, so maybe if it's okay with the committee, we could let you go first.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. C'est très apprécié.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate that. I will make my report and I'll give my report in French. At the NDP, we have decided to work on several fronts at the same time to improve the work-life balance. As the whip, with my team, we worked on certain issues which would improve the lives of MPs. We've already made progress on some things, and some things are being worked on now. I'll talk about what's coming down the pipe. I met with Teresa Kavanagh, with the Speaker of the House, and Marc Vosk. We had several requests, and the reaction was really good. The cooperation from the speakership was outstanding and greatly appreciated, and they agree with most of our requests. And like I said, some things have already started, and others are coming up. For instance, one thing that's already been done is for parking. Spots reserved for pregnant women or young families. 3 spots have already been set aside. One at the Centre Block, one at the Confederation Building, and one at the Justice Building. And they've already been identified with stickers or with signs. Now, there were also issues with regard to daycare. They don't take infants under a certain age, under 18 months. And if parents want to sign their children up part-time, that's not possible. So that was hard. However, in the meantime, Human Resources have said that they would help young parents find a caregiver for their children. So that was also greatly appreciated. One of our bigger requests, and we were really happy to get a positive response, was to get a room dedicated to parents with young children. So actually, on the 6th floor of the Centre Block here, there is one such room. It hasn't been configured yet, but there's going to be playpens or cribs, high chairs, microwave, and also a workspace for the parent who will be there. because of course the work of Parliament continues. So that's coming. Even though the NDP made these requests, young parents or parents from all parties will benefit. If there are 6 parents, but if at some point there are 6 parents with 6 young kids, well, maybe we'll need a bigger room. But for now, we have this one room, and that'll be extremely useful. We also talked about these things as they apply for the West Block, because soon we'll be leaving this building and the House will be sitting in the West Block. And we'll have to have the same type of accommodation in the West Block when the House sits there. And after that, when Parliament comes back to the Centre Block, we should plan for this kind of thing in the long term. We mentioned this to Mr. Bosk and to the Speaker. We also talked about all kinds of other things. For instance, access to healthy food when cafeterias close in the other buildings. In the Confed and Justice buildings, there are machines, vending machines with junk food, and that's certainly not the best thing for mothers who are nursing their babies or the rest of us. And then there was the matter of high chairs, because at 6 months, children can sit up, so we'll need something appropriate for very young children. And we also noted that after 8 p.m. at the Confederation building, the side door where the shuttle buses stop, so again, this entrance is closed after 8 p.m. So if there's a parent with a stroller or an MP in a wheelchair, that side door is closed and the front doors have steps, so that doesn't work, and we mentioned this to the Speaker as well. We also thought that we needed a safe space for people to cross at that place, because there's no safe place for people to cross to get to the other side onto the hill. And the last thing we mentioned to the Speaker of the House is that votes which take place right after QP seem to be very popular with young families, because it means work hours are concentrated. It means they don't have to leave the hill and then come back at night, which is harder, again, if they have kids. That completes my report. As you can see, these are all really concrete things which will go towards helping young families on a daily basis. And I'm really pleased about the reception that we got from the Speaker of the House. Thank you.
Okay, just for the minutes. This was Marjolaine Boutin-Sweet, the whip for the NDP, giving this report, and we'd also like to welcome Sheila Malcolmson to the rest of the committee meeting. And I don't know if anyone had any questions or anyone else from the NDP wanted to add to that before we go to the other parties. Mr. Christopherson?
Sure. I might just suggest that by way of proceeding, that we then hear from the other 2 caucuses and then throw it open to see how much we line up and whether there's any discrepancies, in which case then we would want to talk those through.
Okay, that sound good? Okay, let's go to the Conservatives.
Okay. Yeah, I'll be fairly brief. I think our caucus actually found it quite difficult, given the depth and breadth, I guess, of the proposals that are out there, and including even we just heard some new suggestions and ideas in the report that the NDP whip just gave. So our caucus actually found it very difficult to really be able to provide a lot of opinion on proposals that I think are quite extensive in their and varied, I guess we'll say, and obviously there's a lot of factors in those that we haven't had a look at yet. Some of them, there's obviously a lot of cost that could be involved. There's unintended consequences that could be involved. So I think our caucus is in a position where they'd like to maybe have the committee narrow down a bit more what some of the proposals might be, or what sort of areas the proposals might be in, before they could really give a lot of feedback in a lot of areas. But I think the one thing that I was quite clear in our caucus was that the idea that that's been discussed quite heavily and been in the media quite a bit, which is the idea of members not sitting here on Fridays, was something that our caucus certainly didn't feel it could support, and anything couldn't support.
Okay,
we couldn't support that.
Okay.
And I think really anything that would be, whether it be in the name of family friendly or any other rationale that might be given, anything that would remove, the accountability of the government to the House of Commons is something that we wouldn't entertain or wouldn't support. So that would be one lens in which we would look at anything, is if it's something that would appear to remove the accountability of the government and the House of Commons, that would certainly be off the table for us. But other things, we would certainly want to have a bit more information as to what avenue the committee is looking to go, and get some sense as to hearing from experts on what the costs might be, what some of the unintended consequences might be, and other implications to the proposals, because there is a pretty wide variety of things that have been sort of mentioned and thrown out there. So I think it might be best that the committee try to narrow things down a bit more before we can really provide a bit more input.
Okay, and Ms. Van de Belt from the Liberals.
Yes, thank you very much. We actually delved into this quite deeply. In fact, we conducted a survey of all of our caucus members, and with quite a good response. So a lot of the numbers that I'm about to talk about are actually very indicative. One of the objectives that we had is that there's a lot of anecdotal discussion going on, and there are people who say, well, it doesn't really affect all that many people. How many of us have kids anyway? And so what we decided was to actually look at the numbers and find out how many of our caucus members are, how much does this affect caucus members? And so I will go through some of the results of the survey, because I think that this is actually very revealing and very indicative, and I think it could inform the work of this committee. So on the number of children, we asked MPs how many children they had, and 78% of the MPs in our caucus are parents of the people that responded. 17% said they do not have children, and another 10% said that they are expecting children or are planning to have children in the future. Now, the reason that adds up to 105% is because 5% of those who already have children also said that they were planning to have more children, which means that 10% of our caucus could very well have children during the period that they are here as members of Parliament. Now, as far as the ages, 47% of the people who responded had children younger than the age of 16. So that's about half of those 78% who have children are actually dependent children, young children that need more care. And just for a further breakdown, of the number of children, 39% have 2 children, and 14% have only 1 child. And then there are 17% of our caucus have 3 children, and another 6% who have more than 4 children. And I can say anecdotally that I spoke to one of my colleagues who has 6 children and also lives in a rural, very remote area, and the difficulties that he's having, particularly if he wants to bring his family here to Ottawa, it uses up pretty much all of his travel points just to bring them one time. And so I think that there is an appetite for families that are larger to be able to have some kind of accommodation so they can actually bring some of their children to Ottawa from time to time. And then, interestingly, there were almost 6% of caucus that say they are expecting children. Now, that is something that's self-identified, but we had probably about 60% of our caucus respond to the survey. So I think that's something that's quite indicative. And another 5% who are preparing to have children. So that would indicate that it would be imminent. When we looked at some of the other questions regarding the child care, 89% agreed that daycare services should be more flexible. And so one of the things, that's the flexibility. Whether or not daycare should be moved to Centre Block, or in the case where we might be sitting in West Block, the answer was that, let me just check the percentage, 80% of the respondents said that the daycare should be in the same building where members spend most of their time. So right now that would mean Center Block and then moving to West Block when the chamber is in West Block. And my understanding is the daycare is right now near the Justice or the Confederation building. So that's quite a distance if somebody wants to just go down and see their child. There was also quite a bit of discussion about the flexibility of the daycare in terms of the hours of the daycare, and also the fact that you can't use it intermittently. So for that family of 6 who comes here, and they might only be here for 1 sitting week, and then they're home again for 3 weeks, that family can't avail themselves of the daycare because the daycare is only available to those who are there on a permanent basis. So there was a lot of discussion, and this was actually something that generated quite a bit of discussion, that the daycare should actually be reflective of the reality of the lives of members of Parliament. Now, one of the things that I'd like to also indicate is we only surveyed members of Parliament. We didn't survey staff. And of course, staff, some of the answers might be different. And I think that as we go on in this study, it will be very important that we also get the opinions of staff and try to perhaps do almost a similar kind of survey amongst some of the staff, because of course they're here in Ottawa all the time. So that would be very different. One of the things that came up when we were talking about inclusive Parliament and work-life balance was the fact that there are dietary restrictions, and I'm very pleased that my colleague from the NDP actually mentioned this as one of the barriers, because we did include a question in our survey on this, and it turns out that 8% of our caucus has food allergies of some sort. And then an additional, I won't go into every single one because we have the percentages for lactose-free, low cholesterol, all of those. But I think the big ones are 8% are some form of vegetarian, so either vegan, vegetarian, but as a category combined. And another 3% are kosher, and another 7% halal. So that indicates that, of course, with the food, that often our hours are incredibly long, and we can't leave the committee room, we can't leave the chamber if we're on house duty. So the only food that's available may or may not be able to, this goes to the inclusivity of Parliament. And then moving on to, okay, that was the question on diet. Now moving on to the issue of the chamber reform. A majority of the caucus, when asked the simple yes-no question, and I know that our committee has actually delved into this in a lot more detail than yes and no, but when discussing the Friday sittings, it was about 3/4 of the caucus that said that we should eliminate Friday sittings. Now, they haven't had the benefit of the discussion about parallel chambers or alternate methods, but what was interesting about this was the exact same number, 76%, said that we need to replace that lost time elsewhere. And so I think that's very, very important to note, that there was almost 100% agreement among those that thought that we should compress the work week or find some way to eliminate Fridays, that we need to not have less time that we're sitting. And and then we broke that down a little bit as well, and 50% agreed that we need to add extra time on the days other than Fridays. And in the discussion on this, a lot of people were talking about starting at 9 o'clock instead of 10 o'clock on other days of the week, or even trying to add 2 days. We talked about the dual sittings in 1 day and other possibilities like that. But there was a general perspective that people, that caucus members and the government, we need to have the time to get our agenda through, to get legislation through. And there was virtually no appetite for eliminating Fridays and not making up those hours somewhere else. 20% said they would support extra sitting days. And I think that's also indicative. And just anecdotally, I did speak to some of the older members of our caucus who said that a day that starts at 7 or 8 a.m. to start preparing and then goes until 9, 10 o'clock at night is actually very difficult for some of the older members, whereas some of the younger members are saying, I need to be home in my constituency to do the work there or with my family, and would rather sit those long, long days on Monday through Thursday. So this is a much more complex topic than first what it looks like just at first. So, but then interestingly, 30% said so this is almost a third of our caucus, said they support both adding extra time to other days and adding extra sitting days. So there's quite a bit of support for maybe changing the way that the calendar is, but not necessarily any one way that has been proposed. So I think that there were a number of comments. We had an open section in the survey. And by the way, I would be happy if any of the other caucuses want to have a copy of what our survey questions were. I'd be happy to give them to you, and you not necessarily all the replies, but I can give them to you if you wanted to survey your own caucus or even the staff. But there were several comments.
If you send that to the clerk, she'll just distribute it.
I will do that. Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. On the chamber reform, a number of open comments, and there were dozens, and I could probably, I'm not going to go through every single one, but there was quite a bit of comments that talked about heckling and even applause. And so the idea that we could actually make Parliament more friendly, more amicable if there was less heckling. And this particularly came from a number of Women's Caucus members. And I think that the reason for that, of course, is because if you want to attract more people to Parliament, if they see that kind of behavior, it's not something that entices a lot of women or a lot of other individuals to run for office, become members of Parliament. And certainly we've all had the case where we've had school groups who, they're looking at the behavior in the House, and this is something their own teachers don't want their students to be learning. And so, I've even had at one point, I know Samara was doing a Twitter chat, and at one point we even had, there was a 13-year-old girl, and she was in the lobby. It was the daughter of one of our members, and I asked her what she thought about it. And she said, well, if I tried to do this in my school, my teacher would dock me marks. So I think, just in terms of the lessons that we're showing to the young people who might aspire to politics. And that was actually, there were quite a few comments about the decorum and the heckling and the game playing and posturing. But the one that surprised me a little bit was the applause. There were quite a few people who said we could save a lot of time if we didn't do standing ovations every time somebody spoke that we agreed with, and particularly in question period where we see regularly we're going over time in question periods. So that's something I actually see as a positive thing. But if it's something that's taking away from our work, that was certainly something that was brought up. Video conferencing technology was brought up both in the discussions that we had in caucus, but also in the comments. And I think that there was a lot of support for the idea that, we're all sitting around the table right here. And if one of us had something, an emergency with our family or something very, very important in our constituency, I know a number of people, my colleagues who are women, who had to fly back to their ridings to do Women's Day events on Tuesday and then fly back. And in fact, one colleague who said her flight was at something like, she was leaving at 6 o'clock right after the House was adjourned, and then she flew home. She did a 7 a.m. event. Then she did another event at 9 and went straight to the airport to fly back to be able to be back in time for question period. And, if people do have to be away, with the committees, there's no reason why we wouldn't be able to have, we allow the witnesses to video conference, but we're not allowing our own committee members to video conference. And that was something that, using technology more, the recognition that this institution is still working exactly the same way it did 150 years ago. That was a time when if you wanted to come and have a talk with one of our colleagues, you actually had to get on a train and come to Ottawa and then spend the time here. And today we can have a teleconference where all of us could be on the same teleconference and be in completely different parts of the country. And so there was a strong sense that we need to modernize Parliament. Most businesses, certainly when I was working internationally, the United Nations, I had staff on 5 continents, and we were able to function predominantly through Skype, and we were functioning as a coherent group and knew each other as if we were sitting side by side. So that was probably the largest one, and I do know that there was a draft report of an all-party women's caucus that talked a lot about the use of technology. So that would be something I think we could delve into. And then there were a number of suggestions about improving technology on the Hill, including the idea of electronic voting, but notably 63% of our caucus members believe that you have to be here in person to vote. And then there was another 30% or so that said that you can use technology for certain, like if you're on the Hill somewhere, that you can vote, but you have to be somewhere in the parliamentary precinct. So, you know, for instance, for young mothers, if they're with their child, but they're at least here in Ottawa, in the parliamentary precinct, that there might be a mechanism of voting that way. And then, of course, the votes after question period. That was another one that came up, and I know we've been doing that. Certainly I just want to specify, Mr. Chair, that none of these things affect me. So in some ways, I'm the ideal spokesperson for this because my stepdaughter is grown up, and so I don't have dependent children, and I live in Ottawa. My home is literally a 15-minute drive from here, unless there's snow or traffic, but in most circumstances, it's a 15-minute drive. So for me, this is, I'm not speaking to this because of any personal interest in this. I think it's very, it was very indicative that some of my caucus colleagues didn't want to speak publicly. They only wanted to speak privately about this or through the anonymous survey, because they felt that if they were to raise this kind of issue, that they would somehow be seen as lesser or not wanting to do their work. Or so there were a number of people that responded privately to the survey, but didn't want to say it publicly. So, and then of course I agree with the some of the comments that came up through the NDP as well about the sixth floor and things like that. That came up too. But I don't want to take too much of the committee's time. I just thought we went to a lot of effort to put together this report, and I think that it was worth it to be able to go into it in some detail. Thank you.
Mr. Sims? Oh, Mr. Christopherson.
Just briefly, would thank everybody for their feedback. I'm going to ask our whip to just give her thoughts on follow-up. A couple things, though. We're clearly going to run into a problem on the Friday thing because your caucus was overwhelmingly interested, even though the time would be made up. Ours overwhelmingly was not interested. Yeah, mostly because of the trade-off. When they started looking at losing constit weeks or sitting later, or that whole idea of compressing 2 days into one, all are more problematic to our caucus than being here on the Fridays. So that could be a major area of disagreement. The only thing I also want to mention, just a personal thing, under the issue of security, we haven't yet had a chance to talk about the green bus system, but the last government, all but decimated the green bus system. It's inefficient and costs all kinds of productivity. We've had to change the hours of committees meeting because it takes so darn long to get around. But the one I want to raise in particular in this context is 1 hour after the House is done, the buses stop. Well, there's an awful lot of us that are still meeting in Centre Block, in East Block, and I'm not, not so much myself, but I'm thinking of others walking around at 10, 11 o'clock at night, but even independent, even just ordinary MPs walking around, being on the bus is sort of the first casual bit of security that's there. Without the buses, that means at 10 o'clock at night, you've got MPs wandering around on Parliament Hill, not the greatest kind of safety, but not to mention for women or others who may feel particularly vulnerable being out in the dark that late at night, not to mention people who have any kind of a disability. And the older I get more and more of them. And so it's a long walk, I'll tell you, from East Block all the way down to the parking lot. So there's a whole host of issues, and I'm hoping at some point the government will indicate that they're reviewing that whole system. It all started with a cost-saving measure, and they laid off droves of the drivers, and that's what led to cutbacks in the service. It's not efficient. It doesn't serve members or staff well, and I do hope the new government is going to undertake a review of that green bus system to make it the system that it should be. And with that, Chair, I'd like to ask my whip to maybe provide a couple of comments to what she has heard. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Oui, merci.
Thank you. Two things. First, something that really came out from our talks at the NDP is that regardless of the decision taken at the end, we cannot only think of MPs, but we also have to think of staff. our teams, our assistants, and people who work for the House of Commons. Again, work-life balance is also important for them. Second, with regard to what Ms. Vanderbilt said, you talked about travel points for families with many children. Some people bring a caregiver with them, a grandmother, an aunt, a sister, a brother. So, as it now stands, there's no way to include them into the travel point system. It's not very flexible today. Those are my 2 points.
On to Mr. Christopherson.
Oh, yeah.
Just in response to Mr. Christopherson's comment, first of all, about the Fridays, there really wasn't consensus. So I think that our committee has, I think, quite a bit of latitude to talk about how to make that, particularly for those who have a lot of travel time. Our chair, for instance, I think there's a lot of latitude because we didn't really come to a consensus, and the yes/no question also didn't delve into a lot of the things we've been discussing in the committee. But one of the issues that came up in Women's Caucus, which, well, not in, but amongst the women, is, I think, very telling because one of the women said, well, once I got here, I could see that I can trade my Fridays, that we're not always on house duty, that, so often on Thursday evening she's able to go home because there's people like me who are quite happy to take on the Fridays. She said she didn't know that before she ran. And there was one occasion where she actually was running for nomination and gave up she didn't run at that particular point in her life because she had young children and didn't want to be away 5 days a week. And she said, had she known that she would be able to come back on Thursday nights and sometimes maybe come in a little later on Monday, that might have actually changed her decision at that time during that election cycle. So I think we can't forget, and we're all here, and we know how it all works, but we can't forget the deterrent effect on a lot of people with young families and on a lot of women when we're looking at the Friday sittings. That's not to say we haven't come to any conclusion on that, but I think that's something that's certainly worth considering. Now, on the security, I'm actually very pleased that you brought that up because one of the things I noted when we had the security officials here the other day was the discussion about constituencies and the fact that there's nothing provided for residences. And this is something, I mean, obviously for me as an Ottawa MP, it's a lot easier for someone to follow me home from Parliament, for instance, or something like that. That line isn't as blurred, but I think that, for instance, there are some of my colleagues who don't have security alarm systems in their homes and are installing very expensive alarm systems solely because of the nature of their public responsibilities. These are things that to my knowledge, they haven't been discussed, but from a woman's perspective, I'm walking down to the parking lot, 35, quite often late at night. And as you said, we have meetings that go till 10, 11 o'clock sometimes. So I'm walking to that parking lot and then getting in my car and then driving home. And so I think that an issue of security, that could very well be one of those topics that we should come up, both because we are the committee that is responsible for the estimates for the security service, but also because of the family-friendly parliament. This is something that can be a tremendous deterrent for women to want to run if you know that your security, especially if there's people out there, and there always are, who may not necessarily be pleased with what you're doing, and they might take that out in certain ways as a public official. I think that's something that affects probably women predominantly a little bit more than men. So that would definitely be, I think, something to add to our study on inclusive parliament. But thank you for bringing it up.
Excellent. Thank you for the feedback.
I'm going to go to Mr. Sims and Mr. Graham. Before I do, though, David, you might also bring up, if nothing's been done on the buses, bring it up when we do main estimates. Maybe warn the speaker in advance you're going to bring it up so they have an answer.
Yeah, I was hoping for a chance to shoehorn it in the other day, but it really seemed kind of small compared to what we were dealing with. But I appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Sims.
Yeah, I'm not sure if this is germane to the conversation, and maybe everyone realized this, but I think it bears repeating that fundamentally, when we get elected, we have the one fundamental choice of either living here or living in the riding. And there are many families, I'm sure when it comes to the Friday situation, there are many families who live here would not opt for the Friday or would sit on Friday, sorry, because of the compressed time. Everything gets compressed into one side, so we should be careful so that if we don't make a decision, it puts the people who decide to bring their families to Ottawa, put them in a precarious situation, because it could very much do that, even though the numbers may be overwhelming that most families live in the ridings. And of course, that Friday option would be good. I would think the first place to start is find out where most of your MPs live and move your regulations and your rules and your changes around that.
Mr. Graham.
I think when it comes to Friday sittings, we're going to have to defend our position on it, whichever way we go on it, to all of our caucuses and all of our colleagues. It's not obvious. There's not an obvious answer for it. And whether we say we're going to keep them or we're going to toss them, we're going to have to defend it. And it's going to be a challenge and a lot of arguments to be done on that. But I want to make sure we don't fall into the Michael Chung trap of using legislation to solve problems that could be solved through whips offices. So if it could be solved with House duties, great. Let's look at that. Let's look at that as the nuclear option to go further than that. On the buses, there's a lot of, and this is why I really want the buses to come talk to us eventually. There's a lot of things we can do there. We can make better buses that are more accessible, that have more efficient routes instead of going all the way out to the parking lot and all the way back. Now, I ran into Senator Nancy Green-Rain the other day at an event in Mont Tremblant, and she chastised me for even considering using the buses. So that's another whole point. But I leave that with that. I'm very much looking forward to tackling the bus issue head on. We have other options too, like why don't the buses run to the airports on Monday mornings and Thursday nights, or that kind of thing. There's so many things we can explore that we should be exploring.
I'm careful not to participate in debates, but I just wanted to make a point personally that I've traded off all my Friday sittings this year, so that's not the issue, but the issue is the votes Thursday night. I mean, as you know, I got about 12, 14 hours to get back to my riding. And if there's a vote Thursday night, then I can't get back Thursday. So whether or not there's a Friday sitting, I'm traveling all day Friday anyways. So, any more comment? Mr. Reid.
I was actually getting a bit worried we wouldn't be able to get to other matters. I still have a motion on the floor regarding bringing back the members of the advisory committees, and I'm hoping we'll be able to get to that and perhaps have a vote on that today. I did want to say, just on this subject though, on the Thursday matter is a really good one, and I think that can be dealt with by a separate change to the standing orders to move it. If it was after, am I right that if it was moved to right after a question period on Thursdays, that would be okay from your perspective? You arguably have the biggest travel problem of anybody here, so your answer would be important.
Yeah, that'd be a lot better.
Okay.
Oh, it changes all the time. Ms. Vanderbilt and then Ms. Sahota.
I just wanted to respond to Mr. Reid's point. I think sometimes it's not the pre-scheduled votes, but it's the possibility of dilatory motions or things that are unexpected, and it's for that reason that often there's a certain number of MPs that have to be within a 15-minute of the Hill. And so that's something I know that when we have the late show, often like we can go on autopilot, and so there's ways that we could perhaps accommodate, even on a Friday, that we could accommodate that by assuring that, it's I know that the issue of quorum is in the Constitution, so it's not likely our committee is going to be addressing maybe reducing quorum, but it could mean going on autopilot more often, where on a Friday you know that there will not be a kind of a vote where suddenly you need to bring back a number of MPs into the House on an unexpected vote. So, and I think that that's more the case than, I don't think even since I've been here we haven't had a pre-scheduled vote on a Thursday night. But there's still a requirement for us to have House duty and to be present. So I know a number of my colleagues have told me about that.
Anita's quite right about the point. I hadn't taken into consideration. I'll just say, though, what tends to happen with the Thursday votes is not that they actually happen. It's that parties play this game of threatening each other. So you're not sure up until the last moment whether it's going to happen. And that's dealing with that gamesmanship. I'm not sure how you do it. Some kind of rule change would do it, but
like you say, that could be changed in the rules. We've done it for Fridays. There's no votes on Fridays. So, did I have someone else on the list, Ms. Sahota?
Yes, I just wanted to point out that I think it would be very useful if Anita, hands over that survey. Perhaps the Conservatives especially could take that survey, because we haven't been able to get much feedback from you, and you have a lot of members in the House, and it's important to make sure that we know how your members feel, because I'm starting to feel that perhaps, at times, like Anita was saying, some of the members are more willing to participate and say how they feel anonymously, and they're not willing to do so out of fear of being chastised or looked down upon because they don't want to work hard enough. And that's surely not the case, even though the media at times we're seeing articles where they're already starting to spin this as we want to work less. We just want to figure out how we can get good representation in this House and not have certain people discouraged from running in this election. Something we were talking about with the minister that so many people want to do, and take a lot of pride in representing their people. We want to make sure we get a good balance of those people. And I've personally talked to a lot of Conservatives that have strong views on family-friendly politics and do want to see certain areas of change. That may not necessarily mean the Fridays or whatever, but at some point, Mr. Richards was talking about, they definitely don't want to see us removing accountability. So I don't know where that's coming from, because I don't think in all our discussions we've ever, talked about removing any sort of accountability. We'll still be having question period, and we're still trying. I think everyone's pretty much in consensus from the feedback that we do have so far, that we don't want to eliminate hours. We want to just figure out how we can schedule our days to accommodate some of the needs that some people have. So I needed to say that, and I really urge that everybody get involved in this important discussion. We have the opportunity in this Parliament to make some changes so that we can see better representation in the future, and if we don't take it seriously now, then, quite frankly, all our parties are going to suffer. I don't see this as just a Liberal problem. The NDP, the Conservatives, I'm sure you want to attract more variety of people from different backgrounds into your caucuses, and so I think we should give this exercise some seriousness and put some effort and make sure everybody is consulted within your caucuses, because I've talked to people on all sides of the parties, and there's a lot of opinions. I'm not saying we're going to all come to one conclusion, but the thoughts deserve to be represented.
Mr. Graham? No, you're finished. Mr. Christopherson.
I know there's been a suggestion that we go back to the motion, but I have to say that I'm kind of anxious for us to get at the witness list, simply because we need to start scheduling those things. They take a lot of time. This thing's already kind of getting a bit unfocused, and so I really think if we're going to keep this file moving in a timely way, Chair, that we need to get those witnesses nailed down and get the clerk coordinating them.
Could I just make a suggestion there, Mr. Chair?
Yeah.
Obviously we don't have a lot of time left today to really have much of a discussion here anyway. I think what might be good is if, I know I've got a list here that we've come up with as a group that we think we can suggest for witnesses. Would it be maybe better if everyone submitted their names, the clerk was to then send around? I know that there was some sent around. I don't know whose suggestions those were, if they were from the analyst or from what you'd received. Okay, so we would obviously add some to that list. Maybe we could have it sent around again so that, we just received it, late yesterday. Might be good for all members to have a chance to look over the list and see what their thoughts are on the various suggestions, and then we could have a proper discussion about it with fully informed, and the next time we have a chance, which I hope would be the next meeting. I don't know what we've got scheduled, but.
So we had the deadline last, whenever it was, and we have a list here which we'll distribute, but if you've got more, we take that suggestion you can add, but everyone can have the list we got so far, everything up to today. Mr. Christopher.
Yeah, no, I'm not looking to pick a fight here, but I mean, part of the business was witness lists, so it kind of surprises me. I mean, it almost seems like they're not ready. I don't know what they're not ready for. We are. I get the sense the government is. This is not new. I don't know what the problem is. I mean, I have to share the concern. Yeah. You start to get a sense of whether or not all three parties are as engaged in moving forward in this as we put forward, but I just leave that there.
There's a,
Yeah, I mean, I
Yeah.
guess I just want to quickly respond to that. I mean, obviously, that's not, you know, we all have an intention to try to move forward and look at this in a full manner. It's just that we, you know, obviously, having just seen some of these lists, we haven't really had a chance to thoroughly look at them. It's not that anyone's trying to delay anything, and I would like to see us get there, but I mean, obviously, we've got, what, 7 minutes or so left in the meeting. I mean, if we want to start the discussion, I guess that's okay, but I do think that Mr. Reid's motion is, you know, there's a pressing time demand on that as well. We've indicated in the motion there that he has that we would see the committee before the end of March, and you know, it seems to me the government's trying to stall and delay that, but I think we need to move forward with that. So I think that actually takes precedence here.
okay, we have to decide, well, there's one thing I'd like to decide on quickly. The chief electoral officer could come on May 3rd or 5th, which is a long way from now, but to give them the time to plan, does anyone have any problem with us picking one of those 2 dates?
Do we have work plans?
There's nothing
current
like
work
that
plan?
for
No.
May, no.
So
Right now,
what do we have, in the absence of a work plan, what do we have scheduled around that, Chair?
around that time.
Yeah.
Right now, it's open.
It's
I
open?
mean, we're going to do our report and stuff, but
Okay. So what are you suggesting, Chair?
either one of those days, Tuesday or Thursday.
Fine. I'll move to Tuesday then, just to give us a focus.
Okay, moved by David at May 3rd. Is anyone opposed to that? Oh, yeah.
Mr. Chair, I just want to confirm that we're not going to find that we're restricted in what we're allowed to ask I mean, every witness who's come here, every single question I ask, or almost every single question, I am being told it's not permissible to ask this question. The witness is only here to talk about one thing, not the other thing. I assume we get to ask him about everything, or do the Liberals have plans to shut that down too?
Well, Mr. Reid, you've been here long enough to know that when we give the notice of meeting, it says what the person's called here for, and that's what you should respect.
So that's
but
why
this-
I'm asking it about this.
So this particular person is going to be, he's offered to come and report on the election, right? So you can, an informal briefing, so.
So does that mean that is your intention to rule out of order questions dealing with the statement he made yesterday regarding the timeline issues he would have with regard to implementing new electoral systems because of the fact that it involves electoral boundaries or distribution, the potential for the timelines that are involved in having a referendum should one occur? Would that be considered out of order, or would that be considered permissible to ask?
Point of order before you answer
Yeah.
Before you answer that, can I provide some input?
Yeah.
Because that's pretty important. I just want to point out that, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe that that's one of the agents of Parliament, and if so, normally the experience is that there's a broad breadth of questions you can ask because they're answerable to Parliament, not to government. And if you deny parliamentarians an opportunity to ask any question, I mean, they're pretty sharp. They'll tell you pretty quick whether that's germane to the points that they're raising. But I wanted to jump in, Chair, and just caution. I would be very, very surprised and have a bit of a problem if you were to rule that ahead of time you were going to start contracting the questions that we could ask an agent of Parliament. I mean, to me, that's really starting to speak to the rights and privileges of member and the separation between Parliament as the legislative arm and government, which is the executive arm.
Anita, did you have a comment? Okay, this is a briefing. We haven't called them. They're offering us a briefing, and we were supposed to have it today, but we postponed it. So I didn't. Other than that, I had no thoughts on it. Okay, so we'll do that May 3rd, and then the other thing I asked you to think about for this meeting was that letter from which you now have from the speaker. Oh, you didn't. Oh, you haven't got it yet.
Okay, Mr. Chair, if I could,
Yeah.
we have 2 minutes left. We have time to have a vote on bringing back the members of the advisory committees to answer the questions that were ruled as being out of order at our previous meetings. Questions which are absolutely germane to their mandate and to the oversight we practice on their mandate and on the minister and on the portfolio of democratic renewal, and questions which the minister now confirmed today she could not answer. And the sole reason that was given by Arnold Chan for saying that the government did not want to pursue this was all unnecessary. And I think actually it was the main reason given by Mr. Graham as well, was that the minister could answer these questions, something which she confirmed today she cannot do, that this is information to which she is not privy. Therefore, I would like us to go back to this. The Liberals, I guess, could talk it out if they want to spend 2 minutes doing it, but it would be nice to get a vote. This was a motion to bring them back before the end of March. We are not going to be back in this place, if I'm not mistaken, until March 22nd. Thus, the reason for the urgency to vote this up or down today.
Okay, I'm happy to go to this in a minute, though, but we have to decide what we're doing. There's 2 days before Easter break. The first one is Budget Day, and we've agreed to meet that day. The second day is the Thursday before Good Friday, and the House leaders have not yet decided whether that'll be a Friday type of schedule. If it is, then we wouldn't, well, I haven't been told.
Okay.
So if it is a Friday type, then we wouldn't have our meeting. But if it's not a Friday type, we would have our regular meeting.
My understanding is that the decision was made, but that the Thursday would be treated like a Friday.
Oh,
Yeah.
no, I don't know.
No.
Sorry?
No?
That hasn't been decided yet.
According to the calendar, it is regular Thursday.
Okay,
Sorry.
They didn't agree?
it's a regular
Oh.
Thursday. It would be like
Oh.
a regular Thursday, so we
Okay.
would be having a meeting that day.
Yeah, apparently that's not finalized. That's what they're kicking that around. I thought it was finalized.
So minimally, we
But
have
we do
to,
it quite frequently.
minimally, we have to decide what we're doing the Tuesday when we come back. We haven't decided that yet. Unless we do these witness lists, which we haven't obviously had time today. Does that sound good? Do the witness lists?
Yes.
Is that okay? Okay, so the day we come back, we'll do witness lists.
Estimates we have to do? Do we have any estimates pending?
We got main estimates, yes. We need 2 hours for that. We need one for the House estimates and then the other for the which? Oh, Elections Canada estimates. So we could do 1 hour on witness and 1 hour on one of those main estimates if you want. Which main estimate would you like to do?
Pushing this out so it can't be done.
No, I'm going to get to that in a second, but we need to know what we're doing. We're coming back.
Just actually,
Yeah.
been informed, the budget day on the 22nd, my understanding is because of all the lockups, there wouldn't be any rooms available. Have you confirmed a room for that day? Because
Well, there wouldn't
we
be
could
any
have
here, but I'm
trouble.
sure there's rooms all over Parliament. Oh, we have a room. We have a room, yes.
We have a room.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, just wanted to double check.
Okay, so can someone suggest an estimate, either House or
Chair, wouldn't it make sense to tie the elections to
Yeah.
the visit of the election commission? That will, quite
Okay.
frankly, Mr. Reid, that should even open up a further broadening of questions that you can ask under that ambient.
Okay, so the Tuesday we come back, the first one will do witness list, the second hour will be the House estimates. Everyone agreed? Okay, and now we'll go to Mr. Reid's motion.
All right,
Go
so,
ahead.
So in practice, if adopted, this motion would mean we'd be inviting the witnesses to come on the Thursday. So am I wrong?
No, you're right. I was going to say that's really take time.
Oh, the Thursday of the week we come back after the break, because that is the only remaining day in March. So I'd just like to get a vote on this. The motion is that the federal members of the Independent Advisory Board for Senate appointments be invited to appear before the committee before the end of March 2016 to answer all questions relating to their mandate and responsibilities. I've already explained why I think that's important.
Christopherson?
Isn't there a speakers list?
There is, but we're also at 1 o'clock, so I need permission from committee to extend the hours if you want to go on.
I can't, no, we've got other commitments.
No permission to go on?
Let the record show that the government side is clearly trying to block this motion from moving forward.